Chapter 18. Wilbur didn't expect to wake up on the sofa, with Tommy asleep and tucked under his chin. But the daunting sight of Techno with a bucket of water in his hands, and Phil watching with a bowl of porridge, made the wake-up call more interesting and threatening. Technoblade, if you spill that shit over us, I'm cancelling your sponsorship of that polar bear. Wilbur muttered loudly as he covered the blanket over Tommy's back and cupped his hand across the back of the boy's neck. Don't threaten Steve, Techno said, stepping forward with the bucket. And it's tradition anyway. Wilbur glared at him. Techno had a running streak of pouring water on people to wake them up when they came home drunk, with his first victim being Wilbur himself, aged 16. Dad, take the bucket off him or I'm calling Childline, Wilbur tempted, holding Tommy closer to his side. As much as he wanted Tommy to wake up cussing out Techno, it was probably not the best time for this to happen. Childline, really? Phil said, shoveling more porridge into his mouth. Try me, he responded with slitted eyes. Techno groaned and put the bucket on the coffee table, probably annoyed that he couldn't add another tally onto the whiteboard in his room. Yes, the bastard had a whiteboard to count this. Good, Wilbur said. He would have flipped Techno off, but Tommy moved a little in his sleep, burying his face into Wilbur's chest. Tommy looked even younger when asleep, with no creases on his forehead, no crinkled nose or exasperation that dulled his bright eyes. The younger boy seemed at peace, softer even. Not that Wilbur would voice any of these thoughts. He'd rather die. A smile curled onto his lips, and he threaded his fingers through the blonde's hair, gently detangling the knots. Treasure the moment, Wilbur. He's been acting weird with you all week, Techno said. Wilbur fumed at the reminder. He didn't know what he did. Well, now he knew, but it didn't make sense. Tommy's drunken words only added to his confusion. Ever since Tommy woke up from that nightmare and his screaming extended at the sight of him, guilt bled through him. Guilt for the unknown, for what he must have done to get such a reaction from someone he viewed as a younger brother. If Tommy told him what he did without sounding fucking insane, then the darkness encasing his heart wouldn't seethe every time the boy flinched away from him, avoided his eyes, and looked at Wilbur as if someone else stood in his place. Not knowing what he did to hurt a person he loved was more painful than Wilbur would have liked to admit. Tommy leaned into his hand, grunting under his breath. Chuckling, Wilbur resumed stroking his hair, and Tommy hummed, content. He doesn't look at me the same way as before, and I don't know what I did, he whispered, the smile on his face fading. He's just getting his dreams mixed up with real life, Will. He told me you were a murderer and something about a war, Phil said, and Techno fidgeted from where he sat. Let him figure it out himself. He'll probably talk to Nikki or someone about it, Techno advised, his eyes locked onto Tommy. Wilbur frowned. Why Nikki? They're friends, are they not? Techno stated, his face and voice devoid of emotion. Just don't pressure him into giving you answers. How can he not have answers, though? There must be a reason for why he's suddenly acting like this to me. Wilbur rebutted, bitter. The brain doesn't behave logically, especially if it's Tommy, Techno replied. As I said, let him do this by himself. Wilbur swallowed down the possessiveness that crept over him, like the shadow that clung to the boy the second he appeared on their doorstep. There was something about Tommy that just bloomed yellow roses in Wilbur's chest the moment he entered the room. He felt like he recognized Tommy from somewhere, but he could never place it. Maybe it was just the part of him that always wanted a little brother, which no longer remained dormant the second Tommy Adele stormed into his life and changed it for the better. He didn't even know how Tommy broke down his walls so quickly, made him open up about his mother's death, and finally accept therapy again after the shitfest that occurred with the Year 12 school counselor. Tommy crumbled down those walls and let the sun shine through the cracks. But then he built up his own walls, casing Wilbur off with no warning. The sunshine wasn't as warm without Tommy by his side. "I just want him back," he proclaimed, wishing that Tommy was awake to hear his honest words. "You'll get him back," Techno reassured, patting him on the shoulder like he usually did to provide comfort. "One day, you will." Wilbur sighed and closed his eyes, his face resting on top of Tommy's head. He willed himself to sleep, hoping that the forgetful ghost he occasionally saw in his dreams wouldn't be crying this time, though he would appreciate some blue right now. In Tommy's superior and completely factually correct opinion, Phil was overreacting. Sure, it was worrying and broke the house rules for him to get blackout drunk at the small age of 15, but it was funny. Well, no, actually it was the opposite to that. From the muddled flashes he remembered from Clementine's party, he had confessed his fear of dying to his best friends, had another breakdown over Wilbur, and may have used Clementine's staircase as a slippery slide at one point. It explained the bruises down his back. Yet Phil's punishment for his mild drinking, heavy drinking, wasn't justified. He knew his human rights, and this breached all of them. After he had showered and taken enough paracetamols for his headache to finally die down, Phil forced him to sit through the longest lecture he had ever experienced. He had been threatened in various ways throughout his many lives, but an angry Phil Kraft took the cake on this one. With the disappointment in his face, the stern look in his eyes, and the fucking finger pointing, it was torture. Because of his so-called reckless and dogshit behavior, his curfew was reduced by many hours. He was banned from ever going to Clementine's house again. He had to text Phil every couple of hours if he went out, assuring the man that he wasn't doing any illegal substances or activities. And, on top of that, he was on bin duty. He was responsible for emptying and recycling every single bin in the household, even Wilbur's, which was a bottomless pit of Amazon boxes, eBay packages, and empty water bottles. Phil also made Tommy hug him for the sake of the older man's mental health, but that part of the punishment wasn't so bad. Even when Phil was pissed, he still gave good hugs. Yet the worst punishment was having to make everyone sandwiches for lunchtime, using his expert recipe, which only he should enjoy eating, not the rest of the household. The three sat on their designated seats at the dinner table, happily enjoying their meals, as Tommy glared at each one of them with every bite of their sandwich they took. It was painful to watch. "So let me get this straight. When I came home drunk, I had to do all the chores, my computer was taken away from me, and I couldn't do anything at the weekends for a month. But when Tommy does it, he just has to empty the bin." Wilbur had been complaining for the past 10 minutes, much to Phil's dismay. "Wilbur, I had to pick you up from the police station for attempted robbery. I think these two are different situations," Phil said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You robbed someone when drunk?" Tommy gasped. He didn't think Wilbur had that in him. "No!" Wilbur exclaimed. This random lady took my skateboard away from me, and I didn't even know why she was at the park that late. It was her son's skateboard that he left at the park by accident, which you stole and claimed yours. Phil huffed, fed up with his son. Wilbur scowled at him. Not my problem he left it there. That mother still glares at me when I see her in public because of you. Just say that Tommy's the favorite, you coward. Tommy is the favorite, Techno said, agreeing. Tommy grinned, smug. Wipe that smile off your face or I'll take away your turbo time, Phil scolded, his tone harsh, despite the amusement in his face. Tommy gaped at him. No, you can't do that, that's illegal. And Ranbu time. Oh, that one's fine. Now that's just cruel, Phil muttered, shaking his head. Nah, do you know what's cruel? Techno asked as he faced Tommy, who didn't like the glint in his eyes. We're having MCC practice later today. Please, no, I have school tomorrow. I'm going to wake up with no bones, he begged. He could practically feel the aches that he would have later this evening. A boneless Monday, Wilbur added. Exactly, Tommy said. Wait, what does that even mean? Well, you boys have fun. I need to go food shopping, Phil interrupted, as if he could already sense the argument that would occur between the three of them. Can you buy some rope from Wix? I want to climb a building and jump right off it after today, Tommy asked. I'll fund the purchase, Wilbur offered, narrowly avoiding the banana Tommy threw at him in retaliation. Add another mile onto Wilbur's run for me, Tech, Phil said, prompting Wilbur to slam his head on the table, mixing breadcrumbs in his hair. It took an hour for Techno to convince Tommy and Wilbur to stop chasing him around the house as they shouted various threats and creative insults. Then another hour for them all to get out of the house in sports clothing. On the drive to the football field, Techno had decided to torment Tommy even further by explaining some of the MCC minigames in English literature metaphors. He had never read The Great Gatsby, so he had no idea what relevance it had to Sands of Time. Something about how you couldn't fight against inevitability. Techno sat down on the bleacher benches. We can't do hole in the walls since we don't have the equipment, so parkour tag and ace race practice it is. Wilbur's mood fouled at the mere mention of that minigame. Ace race? Are you fucking kidding me? Don't make me add another mile to your course, Techno threatened, not bothered by Wilbur's tantrum, as he handed the two of them Velcro tags that they tucked into the back of their shorts. Let me die. Just kill me, Wilbur groaned, causing Tommy to laugh. You're being dramatic, Techno said. Now, go, chase each other. Tommy's laughter quickly faded, as he did not have fun being hunted by a 6'5" madman. He was certain that tackling the target deep into the mud wasn't allowed in the game, but that didn't stop Wilbur from doing it several times. The lightheartedness in the air, and also the adrenaline flowing through him, ceased the nerves Tommy usually had around Wilbur ever since the nightmare. Perhaps it had something to do with the moment he had with the man last night. All he remembered was crying into Wilbur's arms, saying some sappy shit and falling asleep cuddled into his side. Something Techno would probably call cringe. Regardless, those thoughts weren't things hurtling through his head, especially during MCC practice, where every muscle in his body underwent a cycle of abuse and pain, until Techno graciously granted him a water break. Tommy laid down on the bleacher, staring at Techno, who was amused by Wilbur in the distance as he attempted to climb a tree that was not meant to be climbed on. Yet, Techno's shoulders were tense, and his fingernails were red. You doing all right? Tommy asked as he downed his water bottle. Techno squeezed the body of the water bottle, grinning as Tommy choked on the high pressure. You know, as a responsible adult with a foster sibling who came home blasted last night, I should be asking you that. Tommy spat the water on the grass, glaring at him. Why'd the fuck you do that? Just be glad Wilbur stopped me from waking you up with cold water. If you didn't have a breakdown and some emotional moment with him, I bet he would have let me do it. Techno said. I am so sorry that I'm not in control of how I feel. Tommy quipped. Thank you. Tommy whacked his shoulder. Do you have no empathy? Techno narrowed his eyes. Actually, no, don't answer that. To answer your initial question, I'm fine. Techno said. His voice betrayed his confident words. Well, MCC stresses me out, even though I'm not a contestant anymore. Is that the only thing stressing you out? Tommy's eyes glanced down at Techno's bitten fingernails, making the other cover his hands. I have a fencing tournament soon. It's in 2 weeks, at the beginning of April. He finally said, after a small pause. Ah, the Blade, undefeated champion. Tommy repeated the thing he heard from the guys at fencing whenever Techno beat him in a match. It seemed that Techno had created a reputation for himself in this field. Yep. He sighed, dispirited. Tommy frowned at his tone, but stayed silent for once, allowing the quiet to fester so Techno could gather his thoughts, or even reach a decision about whether he wanted to talk about it with him. When it became apparent that Techno wouldn't continue, Tommy said, I'm worried about my maths mock exam. He hoped that sharing one of his worries would make it easier for Techno to do the same. I can't do simultaneous equations to save my life. Techno's eyebrows furrowed. But those questions are so easy. No, they aren't. They put so many words in it and give the questions its own lore. It confuses me. Tommy said, waving his hands as he spoke. I just want to know what it's asking me to do, and not the entire backstory of why Stephanie has 12 blue t-shirts to begin with. Techno laughed lightly, before looking forward again. I used to do fencing for fun with Wilbur at some point. But then I progressed too far, and Wilbur didn't like going against me. I think I bruised his ego. He exhaled sharply. When I started the tournaments, and each win created a flawless streak, it wasn't just a hobby anymore, and losing wasn't an option. Sounds like you have a lot of pressure on your shoulders. Tommy said, slightly relating. Though Tommy had a streak of losing, of failing to guess his myth instead of winning. Every incorrect answer added another weight to the force compressing against his chest. Bingo. Tommy sat up. How can we make it so you enjoy it again? We? You heard me, dickhead. Well, it would be more fun if you weren't involved. Techno joked. Tommy shoved at his shoulder, trying to push him off the bench, but Techno didn't budge. I hate you. Techno chuckled. No, I'm being serious. I try to be nice, and this is how you repay me? This is exploitation, manipulation, banter is bullying. You make it fun, Tommy. Don't worry about me. Techno said, interrupting his rant. A smile broke out on Tommy's face. I'll make everything fun. Don't try to distract me with flattery. Alright, that's the last time I say anything nice to you. Techno muttered. Go back to training, and tell Wilbur to stop assaulting that tree, it's embarrassing. Reluctantly, Tommy stood up and squinted at the sight of Wilbur kicking the shit out of the tree stump at the end of the field. I feel bad that you share a last name with him. I'll use those very words against you someday. Techno shot back. Tommy scowled, ignoring the warmth he felt at the implication. Even if it was a joke. Was it a joke? Nevertheless, he ran towards Wilbur, already thinking of insults to shout at him as he got closer. The moment Tommy's head hit the pillow when he got home, he fell asleep. Techno's training had burned him out that much. However, the adrenaline that had been running through him for the past couple of hours returned as the void appeared in front of him. For fuck's sake. Ahead of him, Dream sat next to the table with the same board game on it, the Gnosis game. He rushed forward, anger bursting in him as Dream seemed unbothered by his arrival. The last Dream visit ended with the fucker letting him fall off the ledge of the maze wall and giving him the existential crisis about his brother. You fucking piece of shit. You think you could just play your little Monopoly game and act like the last visit didn't happen? He snapped, tempted to knock the board off the table. Dream continued sorting out the 10 playing pieces. He bit on his cheek in frustration. Are you even listening to me? The god gestured for Tommy to sit down opposite him. I'm not playing any more games with you, Zagreus. At the mention of his actual name, Dream looked at him, his lips twisted into a scowl. Oh, that got a reaction out of you. Sit down, Dream ordered, with malice. Tommy did as he said, the tone of the god's voice awakening his slumbering instincts that developed during exile, shifting him back into that complicit Pavlovian dog, conditioned to do whatever pleased Dream. A shiver crept across his back, evoking fear into Tommy as he tried to stop his hand from trembling. Play the game, he continued, the grip he had over Tommy loosening as he handed him the 3 dice. As Tommy managed to secure his first piece almost back to the land of the living, one good roll away from safety, Dream's next words caught him off guard. Now that I look back on it, I may have overcompensated with your punishment. The dice faced black, swallowing Tommy's piece into the river Styx, into death. Tommy glared at him, wanting nothing more than to rip the mask off his face and look Dream dead into the eyes, to see what emotion wallowed in them as he spoke such weighted words so casually. Overcompensated? Tommy repeated, his teeth gritted. You weren't supposed to take this long to guess your myth, Dream explained as he moved another one of his pieces back to the living. Like Nietzsche and your father, you were supposed to learn from your mistakes throughout your rebirths and finally figure it out. Time stopped. My dad? My dad? He pushed back from the table. After all these years, this is when Dream told him this? One heartbreaking reveal after another? The man with piercing blue eyes, a stern grip and shadowing force, his father. The Angel of Death, they called him on the battlefields, before he and his brother were born, as he reaped the souls of those who dared to raise their weapons against him. The name returned in full force, though, after he spilt his son's blood on his blade for the world to see. My dad's cursed as well? Tommy spluttered. The game forgotten about. He couldn't think straight. Was cursed, yes. Dream corrected. He figured it out. Who was he? In his first life? Tommy craved to know what drove his father in that life. The reason why he neglected his sons and left the eldest to do the dreadful job for him. For years he pondered why arrogance and hubris took away the father he should have had. What myth caused him to be so unlovable? Your father was Tantalus. With the roll of the god's dice, it all made sense. Tantalus, a king, never satisfied with the family he had, nor worthy of the respect the gods had towards him. He exploited Zeus's hospitality, murdered and cooked his son into a meal that he served to the Olympians just to test their omniscience. A punishment so tantalizing followed. Forced to stand in a pool of water beneath a low-hanging fruit tree, forbidden to quench his thirst or satisfy his hunger. Eternal denial of fulfillment for not appreciating the greatness you were handed for free in life. Did he have a family after he broke his curse? Tommy whispered, as silent tears ran down his face. Yes. Yes, he did. His father was dead then. He may have died centuries ago. Maybe with another family. A wife that wasn't taken away from him too soon. Children he might have loved instead of despised. A life that didn't disappoint him. His lineage still continues to this day. You're familiar with one of his newest descendants. Dream said. And deep down, Tommy knew who he was referring to. Dream really wasn't lying when he said this foster family was exciting. Did you choose? He began, tired of this conversation. Did you choose the myths in our first lives? I chose them all, Dream said, proceeding with his round of Gnosis. I fucking hate you, he spat. You cursed every important person in my life, forcing us into a life of tragedy, and for what? What the fuck did we even do to deserve all that? I told you before. With hindsight, I see now, I overcompensated. Dream replied, a heaviness to his voice. His blurred vision glowered at the Gnosis board, at his lost pieces. Is that all I get from you? Is that the only inkling of an apology I'll ever get from you? I am sorry, Tommy. Dream moved forward, the action reminding him of when he would have welcomed the touch, flourished under the comfort and adoration it used to bring. Sometimes he wished for exile, the simpler time, where he was dependent on someone else, and he didn't question why such a vile man's embrace didn't hurt. He jerked backwards, his scarred back stinging. Let me wake up. I don't want to see your fucking face any longer. There was a pattern now. Every time Tommy woke up after a dream visit, his body stuck to his bedsheets with sweat, and his head hurt with revelations. School was more painful than usual. Even the song Tubbo played during their music lesson in the practice room couldn't shake the feeling that plagued him since this morning. He had been jumpy all day. Any loud sound or sudden movement had his heart racing, and ice pooling in his stomach. But, as much as he wanted to go home the second the last bell sounded, he had promised Ronbu he'd help him with his coursework in the library after school. The library was empty, and the librarian trusted the two alone, since Ronbu occasionally helped her with sorting out the bookshelves. Tommy sat at the computer with his maths homework in front of him, and Ronbu by his side. His regret for agreeing to this only worsened when he realized Ronbu's coursework was about history, with his chosen subject of W. Soot. Having to read over Ronbu's ramblings about whether or not W. Soot was a hero, anti-hero, or villain didn't help Tommy's current mental state. Tubbo kept spamming their group chat, begging for them to come over to the science block to see the practicals he was doing with his teacher. The occasional videos of Tubbo almost lighting his hair on fire distracted Tommy enough so he didn't lose control of his breathing. Every time Ronbu tapped him on the shoulder and asked him if this sentence made sense, a little bit of Tommy died inside. Could I word this differently? Ronbu asked, pointing at the screen. Soot's decline, as historian Sidney Bradshaw insists, was the greatest single underlying cause of the L'Manberg Wars. This is supported by how Timmy Soot's diary entries during the Pogtopia era suggested that the man emotionally manipulated, and perhaps physically abused him. And the archives of L'Manberg include art pieces that hint at W. Soot's madness, with the ravine representing his growing insanity. His breath hitched as Ronbu read out those words. He thought to keep his tears unshed at the reminder of Pogtopia and the ravine. He could never forget those sleepless nights, with the squeaking of bats and rustling in the walls echoing throughout the darkness. The dim torchlight wasn't enough to erase his fears, so he wrote blindly in that notebook until sleep claimed him. He didn't think over his words before writing them, didn't imagine the inferences that could occur by reading his rants of how his day went, of what his brother did to him during his maddened states. Those ravines ripped the last drop of good Tommy ever saw in his brother. Is that fine? Or should I explain the art more? He tore his eyes away from the screen as Ronbu scrolled down to the art. He thinned his lips to keep himself from whimpering. You haven't referenced the quote or the art piece, he said, trying to keep the hurt out of his voice. The lodge in his throat twisted painfully. And you need to link it back to the historian's quote. How is the abuse Timmy went through during Pogtopia related to the decline of W. Soot causing the wars? Oh, right, yeah, thanks. Ronbu replied, grateful. Something wet dripped onto his trouser leg. Blood dripped from his palms. He gulped and wiped his hands with a tissue, digging the red out from under his fingernails. He grabbed his notebook from his bag after cleaning his hands. He couldn't focus on maths questions anymore. It was mid-March, and he still had no definite answer to what his myth was. He peered at the column of every male Greek myth, with each name having a cross or question mark written beside it. It should be simple with how much experience he had with analyzing his life and attaching vague myths to them. But it was hard. Harder than usual, and he didn't know why. Well, maybe it was because he actually had someone to live for in this life. People that he cared for and didn't want to leave behind. Tommy, how do I say I disagree with a historian? Because David Stevenson believes that W. Soot didn't care about L'Manberg at all. And even though I hate the guy, I still think he cared a little. Without warning, Tommy dashed his notebook against the window. His chair fell to the floor, and he stopped himself from caving his fist into the closest wall. He couldn't do this. He couldn't listen to one of the people he cared for, loved even, analyze and debate his history. The world was against him, and he didn't know how to handle it. He crumbled into himself, biting on his hand to stop the cries that choked him. Dude, what the hell? You could have smashed that window. Does it look like I give a shit about that right now? He seethed, his face full of anger. Look, if this is about the maths homework, I could— It's not! He shouted, guilt washing through him, as Ronbu flinched back into his seat. I don't care about that! Ronbu stood up and approached him slowly. Then what is this really about, Tommy? His friend looked at him as if he was a wild animal, or an explosive he needed to defuse. Tommy huffed out a broken laugh as he realized that that was exactly what he was. The tattoo on his wrist acted as a timer. If he squinted hard enough, he could almost visualize the number of days he had left until he died, until the explosive destroyed him. What's wrong? Ronbu asked, softly. Tommy rubbed at his face, his hands shaking and heart rattling. He picked up the notebook and slammed it onto the desk. Read it. Huh? Read it. Ronbu hesitated before looking at the opened page. The same page that was printed in their history textbook. W. Soot's only recorded message. The words Tommy read before going to bed. How? Ranbu flicked through the notebook. How did you get these passages? He ran his gloved fingers over the writing. Is this real? It's my notebook, Ranbu. Tommy waited for his words to settle in. I'm him. How? He repeated in disbelief, his masked face covering his reaction. He wasn't sure if this was enough. Tommy shrugged off his blazer and rolled up his sleeve to show his tattoo. This is how. You were Timmy? Ranbu asked, doubt still present in his voice. In my first life, yes, he said earnestly. First? This is my fifth. Before he could stop himself, he pulled down the blinds on the window and unbuttoned his shirt. He needed to show more evidence. Tears tugged at his eyes. He just wanted someone to believe him. For someone unaware to know. Tommy, what are you doing? He ignored him and took off his shirt. Look! Ranbu inhaled harshly as he gazed upon the scars on Tommy's back, torso, and shoulder. Scars of different lives, he supplied, trying to keep his shoulders loose. He took hold of Ranbu's hand. Icarus, he whispered as he pressed it against the burn scar on his shoulder. Orpheus, as he trailed over the rips on his torso. And Theseus. Timmy. His voice wavered as Ranbu touched the marks on his back. He was thankful Sisyphus was more of a mental scar. Silence settled between them, and the lodge in Tommy's throat finally eased. He put his shirt back on and gazed up at Ranbu. Do you believe me? He asked, vulnerability drowning in his eyes. Ranbu took his mask and glasses off, and pools of gray stared back at him. Yeah, I believe you. Even if it makes 0 sense, I trust you. You were him. Relief flooded through him. You went through all that? Ranbu's voice ached. Oh my, I made you read about your own brother. I don't want your pity. It's not pity, you idiot. I care about you, and I forced you to proofread an essay about that. Ranbu reached over and hugged him. You are so strong. He relaxed into the hold and closed his eyes, calm for the first time today. How have you kept this all to yourself? You're the first person I've ever told, from the beginning. His words were true. As Ranbu was the first non-cursed person, he couldn't tell him about Nikki. The hug tightened. So every time you die, you come back as a different myth or something? Tommy pushed his face further into Ranbu's shoulder, glad, for once, that the other was taller than him. He didn't want to tell his friend the reality of the curse, that he was on a time limit, and had less than a month to figure it all out before he died again. He couldn't put Ranbu through that. If I figure out what myth is influencing the events of this life, then the cycle stops. I get to rest after I die. No more rebirths. Just peace. Was what he went with, his voice cracking. I don't want to be reborn again. Does Tubbo know? No, he can't know. If Tubbo knew, he would figure out the meaning of the tattoo, and that Nikki was cursed as well. She hadn't told him of her curse, and he couldn't take that from her. I trust him a lot. Maybe with my life, but he can't know. Okay, I won't say anything. Rambu squeezed his shoulder. How can I help? You'd help me? He mumbled as he looked up into Rambu's eyes. They held so much emotion, such sincerity and receptivity. It was comforting. Of course I would. You're my best friend, Rambu said, beaming down at him. Tommy's lips upturned into a smile. I didn't think we were that close, he joked. Rambu huffed and hugged him again out of spite. I'm not doing this coursework anymore. It's time to research some Greek myths. He let go of Tommy and returned to his computer. I'm going to make a fact file on every single one of them. His heart burned. Rambu, you don't have to do this for me. I want to, Rambu said. I would make PowerPoints as well, but as you said, we're not that close. Shut the fuck up. Tommy cut him off, whacking his arm. The door slammed open, and a small brunette boy in a white science cloak with black powder over his fingers rushed into the library. Goggles messed up Tubbo's hair. Guys, I just blew up something and it stinks. You have to see this. Rambu gave Tommy a look. We'll continue this later. Hurry up, they might put out the fire soon. Coming.